Hello, and welcome. It is time to let the day and all of its concerns simply fade away. Find your most comfortable position and gently close your eyes. Let's begin with a single, slow breath. Breathe in deeply. And as you breathe out, feel the tension begin to leave your body. There is nothing else you need to do tonight. Nothing to focus on, and nothing to remember. The story I am about to tell is just a quiet murmur in the background, a calm and steady presence. Tonight we will travel back to the Roman Republic to hear the story of a man whose only crime was to have his name written on a list. So just relax and allow the sound of my voice to accompany you as you drift towards a deep and peaceful sleep. Our story begins in the year 43 BCE, in the final, violent days of the Roman Republic. It is late autumn, and a cold, damp wind blows through the streets of Rome, a wind that seems to carry with it the scent of fear and uncertainty. Just over a year has passed since the assassination of Julius Caesar, and the political chaos that followed has not subsided. It has, instead, coalesced into a new and terrifying form of power: the Second Triumvirate. The city is now in the hands of three men: Caesar's ambitious grandnephew, Octavian, his formidable general, Mark Antony, and the quieter, but still powerful, Marcus Lepidus. They are the absolute masters of Rome, and the city holds its breath, waiting to see what they will do with their newfound authority. In a stately domus on the gentle slope of the Quirinal Hill, away from the grime and noise of the Subura, Decius alias Scaurus believes himself to be safe from this political storm. He is a man of 50, a wealthy equestrian whose fortune comes not from the spoils of war, but from the steady, less glorious profits of olive oil estates in Hispania and shipping contracts in the port of Ostia. His life is one of order, routine, and quiet, intellectual pursuits. His home is a reflection of his character, elegant but not ostentatious, filled with Greek art, a meticulously curated library of scrolls, and the quiet, efficient footsteps of his household slaves. Decius is a man of the old school. He believes in the Senate, in the rule of law, and in the traditions that had made Rome great. He despises the ambition of men like Antony, who he sees as a vulgar demagogue, and he is deeply suspicious of the cold, ruthless ambition of the young Octavian. He had, in the private company of his peers, quietly praised the assassins of Caesar, the so-called liberators, as men who had tried to save the Republic from tyranny, but these were private opinions, spoken only among trusted friends. He was not a conspirator. He was not a soldier. He was a businessman, a man of property and accounts, and he believed this would be his shield. On this particular evening, as the autumn light fades, he is in his study, the Tabulum, reviewing shipping manifests with his most trusted freedman, a man named Sosigenes. The room is an oasis of calm. The warm, yellow light of a dozen olive oil lamps pushes back the growing darkness. The only sounds are the soft rustle of the papyrus scrolls and the distant, muffled sounds of the city. Decius feels the familiar comfort of his home, the solid, reassuring presence of his own walls. The political turmoil, the rumors of armies gathering and senators fleeing, feels like a distant problem, a story from the Forum that has little to do with him. Sosigenes, who has just returned from the markets, hesitates before rolling up the last of the scrolls. "Master," he says, his voice low, "the talk in the city is ... grim. They say the triumvirs have been meeting for days. They say they are compiling a list. Decius looks up from his work, a faint, dismissive frown on his face. There are always lists, Socigenes, lists of new taxes, lists of senators to be watched. It is how these men instill fear. This list, Master, Socigenes continues, his voice even quieter, they say, is different. A list of enemies, of men to be settled with, for a price. Decius sighs, setting down his stylus. He appreciates his freedman's loyalty, but he finds his anxieties tedious. That is the business of the great families, the Corneli, the Fabi, men who commanded legions against the triumvirs, men who stood in the Senate and openly called for their exile. My name has never been spoken in the Curia. I am a merchant. My only allegiance is to the bottom line of my ledger. They have no reason to notice me. He gestures around the room at the symbols of his quiet, orderly life. This is our fortress, Socigenes. Our wealth is in land and trade, not in politics. We are safe here. He truly believes it. In his mind, the coming storm is for the great trees of the forest, the towering figures of the senatorial class who vied for power. He is merely a shrub in their shadow, too insignificant to be struck by the lightning of the triumvir's wrath. His crime, as he sees it, is nothing more than a preference for a bygone era, a nostalgic belief in a system that was already dead. It is, he feels, a private and harmless opinion. He dismisses Socigenes and walks through the quiet corridors of his home. He hears the soft laughter of his wife as she oversees the weaving in the women's quarters. He sees his son, a young man of 17, practicing his rhetoric with a Greek tutor in the peristyle garden. This is his world, a world of peace, family, and commerce. It is a world protected by the sanctity of Roman law and the power of his own wealth. The idea that the brute, bloody force of the political world could smash through his walls and destroy it all seems like a fever dream, a tale told to frighten children. As night falls, Decius stands on the balcony of his home, looking out over the twinkling lights of the city. He can hear the distant rumble of life, but it feels a world away. He takes a deep breath of the cool night air and feels a sense of profound, unshakable security. The triumvirs can have the city, he thinks. They can have the legions and the Senate. Long as they leave him and his family to their quiet, prosperous life, they can do as they please. He turns and goes inside, confident in the strength of his walls and in the power of his own insignificance. He does not know that in the heart of the city, in the Roman Forum, a man is at that very moment pasting a freshly written scroll to the public notice board, a scroll that contains his name. The next morning, a strange and terrible energy gripped the city. It was the energy of a public spectacle, but one laced with a morbid, deadly seriousness. In the heart of the Roman Forum, before the rostra, where orators had once spoken of law and liberty, white wooden boards had been erected overnight. On these boards, in stark black letters, were the names. This was the first of the proscription lists. By dawn, a crowd had already begun to gather. It was a nervous, murmuring assembly of every social class. There were senators, pale and anxious, sending their freedmen to try and get a closer look. There were common plebeians drawn by the grim spectacle. And there was another element, a rougher, more predatory class of men. Former soldiers, gladiators, and street thugs. These were the budding proscriptors, the bounty hunters. their eyes scanning the list, not with fear, but with a greedy, calculating hunger. They were reading not a death sentence, but a list of opportunities. The process of reading the list was one of dawning horror. A man would push his way to the front, his eyes scanning the columns of names. He would find a name he recognized, and a panicked whisper would ripple through the crowd. Gaius Appuleius is on the list. They've proscribed Salvius Otho, the praetor. With each recognized name, the reality of the situation became clearer. This was not a political purge of a few key enemies. It was a wholesale slaughter, a state-sanctioned hunt designed to eliminate all opposition and, more importantly, to fill the triumvirate's empty coffers with the confiscated wealth of the condemned. Decius Aelius Scaurus, in his peaceful home on the Quirinal Hill, was oblivious to the scene unfolding in the Forum. He was enjoying a simple breakfast of bread, olives, and cheese, planning his business for the day. But his freedman, Sossugens, had woken with a sense of deep unease that he could not shake. Driven by this premonition, he had left the house at first light and made his way to the Forum. Sossugens pushed his way through the jostling, anxious crowd. He was a man of letters, not of the street, and the rough energy of the bounty hunters unnerved him. Finally got close enough to see the names for himself. His eyes scanned the first column, filled with famous senators, men whose political downfall was no surprise. He felt a flicker of relief. But then he moved to the second column, the list of the 300 equestrians marked for death. He read the names, his heart pounding with each one, and then he saw it. Halfway down the list, written in the same stark, unforgiving script as all the others, Decius Aelius Scaurus. For a moment the world seemed to stop. The noise of the crowd faded to a dull roar. The name, his master's name, seemed to lift off the board, a symbol of absolute and final ruin. Sossugens understood instantly what it meant. Decius's property was now forfeit to the state. The bounty for his head was 2 talents of silver of fortune to be paid to any free man who brought proof of his death. Any slave who killed his prescribed master would be granted their freedom and a smaller but still significant reward. And anyone like himself who was caught helping a prescribed man would be put to death. Panic, cold, and sharp seized him. He knew that at that very moment the bounty hunters in the crowd were doing the same calculation he was. They would recognize the name as one of the wealthier equestrians. They would know the location of his domos on the Quirinal Hill. It was only a matter of time before a gang of them, eager for the reward, made their way to his master's home. He had to get there first. He turned and fought his way back through the crowd, his movements now frantic. The city that had felt merely tense on his walk to the Forum now seemed actively hostile. Every group of soldiers he saw, every rough-looking man who glanced his way, seemed to be a potential executioner. He ran through the streets, his heart hammering against his ribs, pushing past merchants and carts, his mind screaming a single, desperate thought: I must be first. I must be first. He finally reached the familiar gate of the Domos, gasping for breath, his tunic soaked with sweat. He burst into the atrium, pushing past the surprised household slaves who tried to stop him. He found Decius in the tablinum, calmly dictating a letter to a scribe. The peaceful domestic scene was so at odds with the terror in Sossugens' heart that it felt like a scene from another world. Master Sossugens cried, his voice a ragged gasp. Decius looked up, his face a mixture of surprise and annoyance at the intrusion. Sossugens, what is the meaning of this? The freedman stumbled forward, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. He didn't have the breath for a long explanation. He delivered the news like a dagger strike. The list master. In the forum? Your name is on the list. The words struck the quiet, orderly room with the force of a physical blow. The scribe's stylus froze in midair. Decius stared at his freedman, his face a mask of utter disbelief. It was impossible. A mistake. Some other score, surely. But the look of pure animal terror on Sozigin's face told him it was true. In that instant, the solid floor beneath him seemed to vanish. The walls of his home, his fortress, suddenly felt as fragile as paper. The quiet hum of his orderly life was replaced by a roaring in his ears. The world of law, logic, and commerce in which he had lived was a lie. The only reality now was the list in the forum, and the hunters who would already be on their way. For a long, frozen moment, Decius did not move. He simply stared at his freedman, his mind refusing to accept the words. The foundations of his world, built on logic, wealth, and the rule of law, were crumbling into dust. It was Sozigin's who finally broke the spell, rushing forward and gripping his master's arm, his touch a desperate anchor in the swirling chaos. "Master, you must listen," Friedman hissed, his voice tight with panic. "There is no time. They will come here first. The bounty hunters, the soldiers, they know who you are. They know where you live." Sozignus's words cut through the fog of disbelief. The hunt was not a future threat. It was imminent. Decius looked around his study at the familiar scrolls, the Greek statues, the polished cedarwood desk. An hour ago, they were his possessions. Now, they were merely the spoils for his murderers. His home was no longer a fortress. It was a baited trap, and he was the prey. His gaze fell upon the household slaves who had gathered nervously in the doorway, drawn by the commotion. He scanned their faces, faces he had known for years. Did he see loyalty? Or did he now see a flicker of avarice in the eyes of the stable hand? A calculating glint in the gaze of the cook? Any one of them could earn their freedom and a fortune by simply shouting for the nearest patrol or picking up a kitchen knife. His own home had become the most dangerous place in the world. "We must flee the city," Decius said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "We can make for my villa at Tusculum. The servants there are loyal. From there, we can get to the coast." "No, master," Sozigin's countered immediately, his mind working with the frantic clarity of terror. "Your villas will be the first places they look. The roads will be watched. To leave the city now, as yourself, is to walk directly into the arms of the hunters. You are too well known. Then what? Hide, here in Rome. The city is their fortress." "The city is a labyrinth," Sozigens insisted. "It is a place where men can vanish. We can hide you in the Subura, in the chaos. Let the first wave of the hunt pass, the most violent and greedy. When they think you have already fled or been killed, then we can plan a way out of Italy." It was a desperate gamble, but Decius knew he was right. His only chance was to become a ghost, to disappear into the one place a man of his standing would never be expected to go. The decision was made. The time for denial was over. The time for action was now. "My family," Decius breathed, the word catching in his throat. He thought of his wife, of his son. "They are not on the list, master," Sozigen said gently but firmly. "The triumvirs want you, and your fortune. Your presence here is the greatest danger to them. You must go." It is the only way to give them a chance. The logic was brutal, but undeniable. He was a plague carrier, and his only hope of saving his family was to quarantine himself from them. The transformation had to be immediate. He stripped off his fine embroidered tunic, the garment of a wealthy equestrian, and let it fall to the floor. Sozagines handed him a bundle of clothes he had grabbed from the servants' quarters. A rough, dirt-colored, homespun tunic, frayed and patched. It smelled of sweat and common labor. The fabric was coarse and itchy against his skin. It was the uniform of the invisible, the anonymous poor. He couldn't take his wealth, but he couldn't leave with nothing. He went to a hidden compartment in the wall and retrieved a small, heavy leather pouch of gold orei. It was enough to buy passage, to bribe a guard, to survive for a few months. Any more would be a death sentence if he were caught and searched. He found his wife and son in the atrium, their faces white with a fear that mirrored his own. The farewell was a thing of terrible whispered haste. There was no time for tears, no time for long goodbyes. He gripped his son's shoulder. Be strong. Protect your mother. Comply with them. Give them everything. It is just property. Your lives are all that matter. He kissed his wife, a brief, desperate press of the lips, a silent promise that he would try to survive, that he would send for them. Then he turned and followed Sozagines. They did not leave through the grand main entrance, but like thieves, through the kitchens and the servants' corridors. Places in his own home he had not set foot in for years. They slipped out a small, unobtrusive gate at the back of the property, a gate used by gardeners and delivery men, and vanished into the narrow, winding alleys that snaked behind the great houses of the Quernal Hill. As they hurried down the slope towards the teeming, anonymous chaos of the lower city, Decius took one last fleeting look over his shoulder. He could just see the tiled roof of his home, a symbol of the life of comfort, order, and dignity that had been stolen from him in a single morning. That man, the master of that house, was gone. In his place was a nameless, hunted animal, clad in rags, with nothing but a loyal friend and a small pouch of gold. The hunt had begun. The journey from the Quernal Hill to the Subura was a descent into another world. With every step, the wide, clean avenues of the wealthy gave way to the narrow, winding, and filthy alleys of the poor. The ordered quiet of the upper city was swallowed by a rising tide of noise, the shouting of vendors, the hammering of workshops, the ceaseless, chaotic hum of too many lives crammed into too little space. For Decius, who had only ever passed through these districts on a litter, shielded from the reality of the street, it was a profound shock. The stench of sewage, smoke, and unwashed humanity was a physical assault. He pulled his rough hood lower, trying to make himself invisible, a ghost slipping through the cracks of a city he no longer recognized. Sozagines led him with a quiet confidence through the labyrinthine streets to a towering, dilapidated insula that seemed to sag under its own weight. They climbed a series of dark, rickety staircases, the air growing staler with each floor, until they reached the very top. Here, under the eaves, was Sozagines' own home. A single, tiny room, a cenaculum, that was barely large enough for one man, let alone two. The furniture consisted of a straw pallet on the floor, a single wooden stool, and a clay water jug. A small, unglazed window looked out not upon a view, but onto the grimy brick wall of the neighboring tenement, a hand's breadth away. This cramped, squalid box was to be Odysseus's sanctuary. So Zegenes barred the flimsy wooden door and gave his former master a piece of coarse bread and some water. "You will be safe here for a time, master," he whispered. "No one would think to look for a man like you in a place like this." As dusk fell, the true terror began. The relative anonymity of the daytime crowds gave way to the lawless, predatory nature of the Roman night. The usual sounds of the Subura after dark drunken arguments, the laughter from a nearby tavern, the cry of a baby were now punctuated by new, more horrifying noises. These were the sounds of the hunt. Decius sat on the floor in the corner of the room, plunged into a darkness that was almost absolute, and listened. World, once vast and filled with the complexities of business and philosophy, had shrunk to this single tiny room and the sounds that filtered through its thin walls. It began with a sudden, sharp scream from a street several blocks away, a sound that was cut off with an unnerving finality. Decius flinched, his muscles tensing. An hour later, a more immediate sound. The heavy, rhythmic tramp of hobnailed sandals on the cobblestones below. A patrol of soldiers, their armor clinking in the darkness. He could hear the rough voice of their commanders shouting orders. They were moving slowly, methodically. He imagined them checking doorways, peering into the shadows. He held his breath until the sound of their footsteps faded into the distance. He was a passive listener to the symphony of his city's slaughter. He heard the splintering crash of a door being smashed in somewhere in a nearby building, followed by desperate shouts, the clash of steel, and then a terrible drawn-out cry of pain. He pressed his hands over his ears, but he could not block out the sounds. Each one was a story, the story of a man like him, a man whose name was on the list. The psychological toll was immense. He was a prisoner in this tiny room, his fate decided by the movements of unseen men outside. Every sound became a personal threat. The scuttling of a rat in the rafters was the sound of an assassin creeping across the roof. The stumbling footsteps of a drunkard on the stairs was a bounty hunter coming for his door. He found himself staring at the flimsy wooden bar across the door, knowing it would offer no resistance to a determined group of soldiers. So Zegenes remained a pillar of calm in the terrifying darkness. He sat on the stool by the door, a small knife in his hand, his eyes fixed on the entrance. He spoke in low, reassuring tones, telling Decius to rest, that he would keep watch. But how could a man rest in a city that had become a hunting ground? Decius's mind was a whirlwind of paranoia and regret. He thought of his comfortable bed, his quiet library, the feeling of safety he had taken for granted his entire life. He now understood that safety had always been an illusion, a thin veneer of civilization that the triumvirs had just scraped away to reveal the brutal reality beneath. Sometime after midnight, the hunt came to their very street. He heard a commotion directly below, shouted orders, the terrified pleading of a woman, and then the unmistakable sound of soldiers forcing their way into the ground floor of his own insula. Decius's blood ran cold, and he scrambled to the darkest corner of the room, pressing himself against the wall, trying to make himself smaller, to cease to exist. He could hear them now moving through the building, their heavy footsteps on the stairs, their voices echoing in the stairwell as they worked their way up, floor by floor, searching for their prey. The heavy footsteps stopped right outside their landing. Decius flattened himself in the darkest corner of the room, behind a small pile of rags, trying to will himself into the very walls. He could hear the rough, guttural voices of the soldiers, muffled by the flimsy door. There was a loud percussive bang on the door of the neighboring room, followed by the terrified squeak of a child. Sozajin stood motionless by his own door, a knife gripped so tightly his knuckles were white. Decius heard the gruff voice of a centurion questioning the family next door. He heard their frantic, stammered denials. The floorboards in the hallway creaked as the soldiers shifted their weight. Then, a moment of agonizing silence. Decius's entire world narrowed to that silence, to the space just on the other side of the door. He imagined them turning, their eyes fixing on this last, highest room. He braced for the inevitable crash, the splintering of wood, the final, violent end. But it never came. He heard the centurion grunt, something dismissive. No one of note would live in a hovel like this. You're wasting our time. Let's move on. The heavy footsteps began again, this time receding, clomping back down the 7 flights of rickety stairs. Decius remained frozen, not daring to breathe until the sounds had vanished completely into the cacophony of the Subura below. Only then did the tension break. A long, shuddering tremor ran through his body, a violent, uncontrollable reaction to the terror he had just endured. He was alive, saved not by any cleverness or bravery, but by the simple, arrogant contempt of his hunters. His squalid refuge had for now been his salvation. The immediate danger had passed, but the close call left a deep psychological scar. The tiny room, once a sanctuary, now felt like a fragile cage, suspended in a city of predators. The days that followed were a new and more subtle form of torture. The frantic terror of the first night was replaced by the slow, grinding erosion of hope and sanity. His existence became one of utter confinement. He could never leave the room. He could not even risk looking out the small window for a glimpse of the sky. The world for him was now a space of 10 by 12 feet, with a low, sloping ceiling and the constant smell of stale air and fear. The claustrophobia was a physical presence, a weight on his chest that made it difficult to breathe. He would pace the small space, 3 steps one way, for the other, until Sozijins would urge him to be still, terrified that the constant movement would be heard by the tenants below. He was completely dependent on his freedmen. Sozijins was his jailer and his lifeline. Twice a day, the loyal man would risk his own life, slipping out of the room to buy a small amount of bread, water and cheese from a street vendor, and to gather news. For Decius, the sound of the bar being drawn across the door as Sozijins left was a moment of sheer terror, followed by an agonizing wait until he heard the familiar, soft scratch on the door that signaled his return. He was consumed by a profound sense of guilt. He who had once been a patron, a master, a protector, was now a helpless burden. Sozijins, a man he had legally owned, was now risking torture and death every single day for him. This inversion of their roles was a constant, humiliating reminder of how far he had fallen. The fear of his own death was now matched by the terror that his presence would lead to the death of the only man who had remained loyal to him. This fear began to curdle into a quiet, gnawing paranoia. He trusted Sozijins, but he did not trust the world outside. The bounty for his head was a fortune. What if a neighbor had seen him arrive? What if the baker who sold Sozijins their daily bread grew suspicious of the extra purchase and reported him to the authorities? Every citizen of Rome was now a potential bounty hunter. He started to watch Sozijins with a hawk-like intensity upon his return, searching his face for any sign of fear or betrayal, a suspicion that shamed him even as he felt it. Sozijins brought back news from the city, and none of it was good. More lists had been posted. The initial hunt had become a systematic, citywide purge. He told stories of senators found hiding in their own family tombs, betrayed by their slaves. He spoke of a proscribed man whose own son had killed him to claim the reward and his inheritance. The news confirmed that there was no sanctuary, no loyalty that could be counted on in the face of such greed and terror. Weeks blurred into a monotonous, twilight existence. Decius lost track of the days. His body grew weak and soft from the lack of movement. His mind, starved of stimulation and fueled by fear, began to fray. He would spend hours in silent, despairing lethargy, only to be startled into frantic anxiety by a sudden noise. He was no longer living. He was simply waiting, with a certainty that went bone deep, that this could not last. Eventually, a neighbor would talk. Eventually, a patrol would be more thorough. Eventually, Sozagins's luck would run out. This room was not a sanctuary. It was a tomb in which he was being buried alive. The decision that had seemed so wise in the panic of the first date to hide in the city now seemed like a slow, agonizing form of suicide. He had to escape not just the city, but Italy itself. The risk of flight was terrifying, but it was the risk of a quick death in the open. The risk of staying was the certainty of a slow, suffocating end in the dark. The night of the soldiers' search was the breaking point. After the last of their footsteps had faded, Decius remained on the floor, trembling, not with relief, but with a profound and chilling clarity. The contempt of the centurion had saved him this time, but luck was not a strategy for survival. He understood now that Sozagins's tiny room was not a sanctuary. It was a cage where he was simply waiting for a more thorough hunter to arrive. He rose to his feet, a new and steely resolve hardening in his eyes. The passive, terrified man who had been hiding in the corner was gone, placed by someone who had finally accepted the reality of his situation. "You were right to bring me here, Sozagins," he said, his voice quiet but firm, startling the freedman. "You have saved my life, but we cannot stay. To remain here is to wait for death." Sozagins looked at his former master, seeing the shift in him. He nodded slowly. "I know, master. Every day I leave, I fear I will return to find soldiers at the door. Every person I buy bread from, I wonder if they are an informer." "We must leave Rome," Decius continued. "We must try for the coast, for Greece, for Asia, anywhere but here. The roads are watched," Sozagins cautioned. "The ports are filled with the triumvir's agents. To travel is to expose yourself. To stay here is to suffocate," Decius countered. "I would rather be killed by a soldier on the open road than be dragged from this room like a rat from a hole. I will not die in this darkness." The decision was made. The crushing lethargy of the past weeks was replaced by a new sharp-edged energy. They were no longer just hiding, they were planning. The dynamic in the room shifted. Decius, the man of wealth and command, knew nothing of this world. He looked to his freedman, the man of the Subura, for guidance. Sozagins, for the first time in his life, became the planner, the strategist. Over the next few days, they spoke in low, urgent whispers, formulating a desperate scheme. Their destination, Sozagins argued, could not be the main port of Brundisium. It was the obvious choice and would be the most heavily guarded. He suggested a smaller, less reputable port further down the coast. A place where cargo was loaded and unloaded with less official scrutiny. Their disguise also needed to be more convincing. A simple laborer's tunic was not enough for a long journey. They needed a cover story, a reason to be on the road. Sosajin's plan was daring. He knew of a merchant, a man of questionable character who owed him a favor, who was preparing to send a mule train of wine amphory south. For a price, a very high price, he might be convinced to add 2 more men to his roster. Decius could travel as a junior clerk, responsible for the cargo manifests. Sosajins would travel as his personal slave. It was a perfect inversion of their reality, and a plausible cover for their journey. The most dangerous part was the bribe. It required Sosajins to take a significant portion of Decius's hidden gold and approach the merchant. It was a moment of absolute trust. The merchant could simply take the gold and betray them to the authorities for an even greater reward. But it was a risk they had to take. Sosajins left with the pouch of gold, and Decius endured the most terrifying hours of his ordeal, waiting alone in the room, praying for his friend's return. When Sosajins finally came back, his face was pale but triumphant. The deal was done. The merchant, his greed outweighing his fear, had agreed. The caravan would leave in 3 days, before dawn. The final days of waiting were a unique form of torture. The decision to act had been made, but they were still trapped, their plan entirely in the hands of a man they could not trust. Decius practiced his new role. He allowed Sosajins to cut his hair short and rough in the style of a common clerk. He deliberately stained his hands with dirt and dye, trying to erase the soft-handed look of a man who had never labored. He practiced stooping his shoulders, of walking with a shuffling, unimportant gait. He was stripping away the last vestiges of his old identity, preparing to be reborn as someone else. On the final night, a tense, expectant silence filled the room. Their few preparations were made. A small bundle contained a change of clothes and the last of their bread and cheese. The remaining gold was sewn into the hem of Decius's tunic. There was nothing left to do but wait for the signal. A soft bird call from the street below that would tell them the merchant was ready to move. Decius stood by the small dark window, looking at the sliver of brick wall that had been his entire world for weeks. He was about to trade the crushing safety of this prison for the terrifying freedom of the open road. He did not know if he was walking toward salvation or a swifter death. But for the first time since his name had appeared on the list, he felt a flicker of something other than fear. It was a sense of agency, of fighting back. He was no longer a ghost hiding in the shadows of Rome. He was a fugitive, and his journey was about to begin. In the deepest hour of the night, when the sounds of the Subura had finally softened to a low, drunken murmur, a soft whistle drifted up from the street below. It was the signal. It was time. Decius and Sosajins exchanged a final, silent look. The time for hiding was over. The time for running had begun. They unbarred the flimsy door, slipped out onto the dark, treacherous landing, and began their descent. Every creak of the wooden stairs, every dislodged pebble sounded as loud as a thunderclap in the tense silence. Emerging into the narrow alley behind the insula was like stepping onto another planet. The air was cold and damp, thick with the familiar stench of refuse and smoke. They moved as shadows, hugging the walls of the buildings, their rough-spun cloaks pulled low over their faces. The city was not truly asleep. From behind shuttered windows came the sounds of coughing, of crying children, of arguments that had burned long into the night. An occasional drunkard stumbled through the darkness. They would press themselves into a recessed doorway, holding their breath until he had passed. so Zijins led the way, navigating the labyrinthine network of alleys and back streets with an instinct born of a lifetime spent in this world. He avoided the main thoroughfares, which would still have the occasional patrol of soldiers, and instead led them on a winding, circuitous route through the city's underbelly. For Decius, it was a terrifying and disorienting journey. This was a Rome he had never known existed, a place of profound darkness and hidden dangers. Their rendezvous point was a small, grimy stable yard near the city's southern wall, a place where merchants and farmers coming from the south would keep their animals. As they slipped through the gate, they saw the caravan, a dark collection of shapes in the pre-dawn gloom. A dozen mules, already laden with large clay amphorae of wine, stood tethered and silent. A few rough-looking mule drivers, the Meliones, were huddled around a small, smoky brazier, speaking in low guttural tones. The merchant, a nervous rat-faced man named Credo, detached himself from the group and met them in the shadows. He avoided looking directly at Decius, his eyes darting around the courtyard. "You are late," he hissed. "The manifest is in order. You are Lucius, my clerk. He is your slave. The drivers have been told you are a last-minute addition. Do not speak to them unless you must. And do not draw any attention to yourselves." He accepted a final small pouch of coins from Sozagines, which vanished into his robes. "Your gold buys my risk," he muttered. "It does not buy my friendship. Just do your job and keep your head down." The dynamic shifted immediately. Sozagines, who had been the guide and protector, stepped back, lowering his gaze and assuming the deferential posture of a slave. Decius, his heart pounding, had to step forward and become Lucius the clerk, a man of minor but legitimate authority. He gave a curt, businesslike nod to the merchant, as if this were a normal transaction. The caravan began to move just as the first faint hint of gray began to soften the eastern sky. The sound of the mules' hooves on the cobblestones seemed impossibly loud to Decius. He walked near the front with the merchant, a set of wax tablets clutched in his hand like a talisman, while Sozagines walked near the back with the other drivers. The journey through the waking city was a new form of torture. They were no longer hiding in the shadows, but were now out in the open, part of a slow-moving, conspicuous train of commerce. Every person who glanced their way, every watchman they passed, was a potential threat. Their path led them to the Porta Capena, one of the main gates leading out onto the Appian Way. It was, as they had feared, a bottleneck, and it was heavily guarded. A detachment of Antony's soldiers, their armor glinting in the light of the torches that flanked the gate, were stopping and inspecting all outbound traffic. The line of carts and travelers moved at a crawl. With every slow step, the knot of fear in Decius's stomach tightened. He could see the soldiers ahead, their centurion, a grim, imposing figure, questioning drivers and peering into wagons. Finally, it was their turn. The centurion, a man with a scarred face and cold, intelligent eyes, held up a hand, halting the lead mule. He took the manifest from the merchant Credo, his eyes scanning the document with a practiced, cynical gaze. He looked at the nervous merchant, then at the rough-faced mule drivers. His eyes swept over Sozagines without a flicker of interest. And then his gaze settled on Decius. Your centurion walked slowly towards him, his eyes never leaving Decius's face. He looked at Decius's clothes, at his deliberately dirt-stained hands, at the wax tablets he was clutching. "A last-minute addition to the roster, I see," the centurion said, his voice dangerously calm. He was close enough now, that Decius could smell the sour wine on his breath. "You are the clerk." "Yes, Centurion," Decius replied, fighting to keep his voice steady. To pitch it with the right mixture of respect and weariness, the voice of a common clerk, not a terrified equestrian. The centurion's eyes narrowed. He studied Decius's face, a long, unnerving silence stretching between them. "You do not look like a clerk," he said slowly. "You have the bearing of a man used to giving orders, not taking them. What is your name?" Decius's blood turned to ice in his veins. The centurion's gaze was like a physical weight, pinning him in place. This was it. The end of the road, just a few hundred paces outside the city walls. His disguise, so carefully constructed, had been undone by a lifetime of habit, by a posture he could not unlearn. His mind went blank with terror. Before he could stammer a reply that would surely betray him, the merchant Credo stepped forward, his face a mask of practiced exasperation. He let out a loud, theatrical sigh. "Apologies, Centurion," he said, his voice dripping with the whining tone of a put-upon manager. "This is what I get for hiring family. Lucius is my wife's cousin." He gestured dismissively at Decius. "He comes from a good family that fell on hard times. Thinks he's still the master of a great house. All airs and no sense. I give him a simple clerk's job out of pity, and he still walks around like he's about to address the Senate." Credo leaned in conspiratorially, lowering his voice. "Frankly, Centurion, he's more trouble than he's worth, but my wife insisted." He subtly pressed a few silver denarii into the centurion's gauntlet. It wasn't a large bribe, just enough to be a nuisance tax, a small gesture from one practical man to another to smooth the day's business. The centurion's cold eyes flickered from Credo to the coins in his hand, and then back to Decius. He held his gaze for a moment longer, a faint, cruel smile playing on his lips. He had seen through the lie, Decius was certain of it, but the story was plausible enough, and the silver was real. Chasing down every failed aristocrat playing at being a clerk was too much effort. His job was to stop the obvious fugitives, the ones who panicked and ran. "See that he learns his place," the centurion grunted, pocketing the coins. He waved a hand in dismissal. "Move along." The caravan lurched forward, passing through the gate and out onto the broad, stone-paved expanse of the Appian Way. Decius did not dare to look back. He kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his body trembling with the aftershock of the encounter. He had survived, but the lesson was terrifying. His own nature, his ingrained habits of a lifetime, were his greatest enemy. He was a constant danger to himself. The journey south was not a flight to freedom, but a slow, grinding ordeal, a gauntlet of suspicion and fear. The Appian Way, the great artery of the Republic, was teeming with life, but every traveler was a potential threat. Soldiers were a constant presence, small detachments marching north to the city or manning checkpoints at every major town and bridge. At each one, Decius had to endure the same terrifying scrutiny, the same casual life or death judgment of a bored official. Learn to shrink into his role, to stoop his shoulders, to keep his eyes downcast. To become the insignificant clerk his life depended on being. But the soldiers were not the only hunters. Far more dangerous were the roaming bands of bounty hunters, the proscriptors. They were a new and terrible breed of predator, drawn from the darkest corners of society. They had no uniforms, no rules of engagement. They were simply men, often in groups of 3 or 4, armed with swords and clubs, their eyes constantly scanning the faces of travelers. looking for the telltale signs of wealth or fear that might betray a man on the run. One afternoon, as the caravan rested the mules by a small stream, a group of these men passed by. They were loud, drunk, and brutal-looking. One of them was carrying a heavy burlap sack that dripped a dark, viscous fluid onto the dusty road. As they passed, the sack swung, and the severed head of a gray-haired man, his eyes wide with the horror of his final moments, was briefly visible. The men laughed, boasting of the 2 talents they would collect in Rome. Decius turned away, a wave of nausea washing over him. The head had a name. It had a family. A week ago, it had belonged to a senator, a respected citizen of Rome. Now it was just a piece of bloody cargo, a proof of purchase for a state-sanctioned murder. He saw his own fate in that sack. This was the grim reality of the proscriptions, stripped of all political pretense. It was a harvest of heads. His relationship with the merchant Credo was a constant, nerve-wracking performance. He had to play the part of the clerk, deferential, but not too servile, while knowing that Credo held his life in his hands. The merchant was a man motivated purely by greed, and Decius knew that if a larger bounty were ever offered for him dead than alive, Credo would not hesitate to betray him. He was a passenger on a ship captained by a pirate. His only comfort was Sosagines. The freedman, in his role as a slave, was a constant, silent presence at the rear of the caravan. At night, when they made camp, Sosagines would tend to Decius, bringing him food and water, checking his disguise, speaking in low, reassuring whispers when no one was listening. He was the only link to the man Decius used to be, the only person in the world he could trust. The quiet loyalty of this former slave was the only thing that kept the crushing weight of paranoia from destroying him completely. Days bled into a week, and with every mile they put between themselves and Rome, the tension should have lessened. Instead it grew. He was now far from the only place he knew, a fugitive in his own country, moving inexorably towards a port that was not a gateway to freedom, but simply the next, and perhaps final, trap. After nearly 2 weeks on the road, the caravan finally arrived at a small, bustling port town on the southern coast. The scent of the sea, a mix of salt, fish, and damp wood, should have been a smell of freedom, but to Decius, it was the smell of a larger, more dangerous trap. The town was a chaotic choke point, the last filter designed to catch men like him before they could slip through the Republic's fingers and escape across the water. The narrow streets were teeming with a volatile mix of sailors from every corner of the Mediterranean, sharp-eyed merchants, and, most ominously, a visibly reinforced garrison of soldiers. Bounty hunters, their faces hard and predatory, were a common sight. Loitering in the taverns and on the docks, their eyes scanning every new arrival. The merchant Credo, his part in the charade nearly over, was anxious to be rid of them. He informed them that the ship he had arranged passage on was delayed by unfavorable winds and would not be ready to sail for at least 2 days. For this agonizing period, they were to wait. Credo secured them a small, windowless room in a foul-smelling dockside in a capona that was little better than the room they had fled in the Subura. "Stay here. Do not go out." "I will send word when the captain is ready," he instructed before disappearing, taking the last of their plausible cover with him. The wait was a unique and refined form of torture. In the Subura, they had been hidden in anonymity. On the road, they had been in constant motion. Here, they were stationary and exposed, trapped in a town that was actively hunting for them. The flimsy door of their inn room was their only protection. Through the thin walls, They could hear the loud, boasting voices of bounty hunters in the common room below, bragging about their gruesome exploits. Once, a patrol of soldiers kicked in the door of the room across the hall, dragging out a terrified man who matched the description of a proscribed senator. Decius and Sosigenes could only listen in silent terror as the man was hauled away, his pleas for mercy fading down the corridor. On the third night, a soft knock came at the door. It was Credo, his face pale and sweaty. The captain would see them. The meeting was to take place immediately in a dark, salt-crusted warehouse on the most deserted part of the waterfront. Credo led them through the moonless night, a journey of a few hundred paces that felt as perilous as their entire trip from Rome. The captain was a tall, hard-faced Greek with eyes as cold and gray as the winter sea. He was a man who traded in risk, and his price was high. He listened to their request without a word, his expression unreadable. "I have seen the patrols," he said finally, his voice a low rumble. "They are checking the papers of every passenger on every ship that leaves this port. To walk up the gangplank is suicide." A wave of despair washed over Decius. However, the captain continued, a faint, predatory gleam in his eye. "No one checks the cargo hold of a ship that is already at anchor out at sea?" He named his price, an astronomical sum that would take the last of Decius's hidden gold. He explained the plan. They were to be at a small, deserted cove 2 miles south of the town on the following night, just before the moon rose. A small skiff would meet them there and row them out to his merchant ship, which would be waiting in the bay. "If you are there, we will take you," the captain said. "If you are late, we sail without you. If you are caught, I have never seen you. This is the only offer." There was no choice but to accept. The next 24 hours were the longest of Decius's life. On the following night, under the cover of a moonless, starless sky, he and Sosigenes slipped out of the inn for the last time. They made their way out of the town, moving like ghosts through the fields that bordered the coast, their hearts pounding with every rustle of leaves, every distant dog's bark. They found the cove, a small, desolate stretch of black sand and rock. The only sound was the gentle, rhythmic sigh of the waves washing against the shore. They waited in the oppressive darkness, the cold sea air seeping into their bones. Every shadow seemed to hold a soldier. Every breaking wave sounded like approaching footsteps. The fear that this was an elaborate trap, the captain had taken their money only to betray them to a waiting patrol, was a suffocating weight. After what felt like an eternity, Sosigenes gripped his arm. Listen." Faintly, over the sound of the waves, came a new noise. The soft, rhythmic splash of muffled oars. A moment later, the dark silhouette of a small skiff emerged from the blackness of the sea. 2 silent, dark-clad figures rowed it expertly onto the sand. One of them gestured for them to get in. Not a word was spoken. They pushed off from the shore, the skiff gliding silently back out into the open water. Decius looked back at the land, at the faint, distant lights of the town. It was Italy. It was his home, a land of laws and legions, of poets and farmers. A land that now wanted him dead. He was leaving it all behind, a penniless, hunted exile. The skiff rowed on into the blackness of the bay. For a long time, there was nothing but the sound of the oars and the vast empty sea. Then, ahead of them, a single lantern was briefly lit, then extinguished. In the darkness, they could just make out the hulking, dark shape of a merchant ship at anchor. They had made it. They had escaped the shores of Italy. as the skiff pulled alongside the ship and a rope ladder was thrown down. Decius felt not a sense of triumph, but only a vast, empty weariness. He had survived the first part of his ordeal. He was now a ghost at sea, sailing towards a new and uncertain darkness. The journey across the Ionian Sea was another form of imprisonment. Decius and Sozogians were not treated as passengers, but as illicit cargo. The Greek captain, having received his payment, wanted nothing more to do with them and hid them in the ship's hold. For days, their world was a cramped, suffocating darkness, a space between towering stacks of wine, amphorae, and bales of raw wool. The only light came from a single grimy grate high above. The air was thick with the smell of stale wine, bilge water, and the sea. The constant rhythmic creaking of the ship's timbers and the sound of the waves sloshing against the hull was their only measure of the passing time. Decius spent the voyage in a state of weary lethargy. He was no longer actively hunted, but he was far from free. He was a piece of contraband, his fate entirely in the hands of a man who saw him only as a liability. He and Sosogin spoke little, the oppressive darkness and the shared unspoken fear leaving little room for conversation. After what felt like an eternity, the rhythm of the ship changed. They could hear the shouts of the sailors above, the sound of the great sails being furled. The ship had arrived, under the cover of the pre-dawn darkness. They were brought up on deck and unceremoniously deposited into a small skiff, which rowed them to a deserted stretch of beach. The captain's only parting words were a gruff command: "Disappear." Decius stood on the shore, the soft sand of Greece beneath his feet. The air was different, carrying the scent of pine and unfamiliar herbs. He had made it. He had escaped Italy. A wave of profound, bone-deep relief washed over him, so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. But the relief was tempered by a new reality. He was a stranger in a strange land, a penniless exile with nothing but the rough clothes on his back and the unwavering loyalty of his freedmen. He had one desperate final hope. He remembered an old family connection, a Roman merchant named Tiberius Claudius Pallio, who had made a great fortune in the shipping trade and had retired to a magnificent villa in the countryside near Corinth. Decius had not seen the man in a decade, but he remembered him as a decent, honorable man. It was a faint hope, but it was the only one he had. The journey from the coast to the hills outside Corinth took 2 days on foot. They traveled as they had in Italy, as a humble clerk and a slave, begging for scraps of food and sleeping in open fields. Finally, they stood before the gates of a vast, splendid villa, its white stucco walls gleaming in the Greek sun, surrounded by orderly groves of olive and cypress trees. It was a vision of the life Decius had lost. His heart pounded with a new kind of fear as he announced himself to the suspicious gatekeeper. To be turned away now, after coming so far, would be the final, crushing blow. He was eventually granted an audience. He was led into a shaded peristyle garden, where a stout, well-fed Roman in a fine toga was reclining, reading a scroll. It was Pallio. The merchant looked up, his face a mask of mild annoyance at the interruption. He stared at the 2 ragged, travel-stained figures before him. He did not recognize them. "Master Pallio," Decius began, his voice rough and unused. "It is I, Decius alias Scorus." Pallio squinted, his eyes narrowing. He slowly sat up, a look of dawning, horrified recognition spreading across his face. He knew the name. The news of the proscriptions, carried on the same ships that brought his wine and oil, had already reached Corinth. To see a man whose name was on that list, standing here in his own home, was like seeing a ghost, a phantom of death that had just walked through his front gate. Pallio's face went pale. He dismissed his slaves with a frantic gesture. "Do you know what you have done?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "Do you know the danger you bring to this house, to my family? To shelter a proscribed man is death." Decius stood before him, stripped of all his former pride. He did not argue or make demands, simply told his story, his voice a flat, weary monotone. He spoke of the list, the escape from his home, the hunt through Rome, the terror of the journey. He asked for nothing but a place to hide, a temporary sanctuary until the madness in Rome had passed. Pallio was a good man, but he was not a brave one. He paced the mosaic floor of his garden, torn between the sacred Roman duty of hospitality to a friend and the primal, powerful instinct of self-preservation. Decius could see the war in the man's eyes. Finally, after a long, agonizing silence, Pallio stopped. "I cannot turn you away," he said, his voice heavy with resignation and fear. "For the sake of my father's friendship with yours, I will help you. But you must be ghosts. No one can know you are here. No one." The relief that flooded through Decius was so immense that he felt his legs weaken. Pallio led them to a small, secluded guest house at the far end of the sprawling estate, a place used for storing gardening tools and forgotten furniture. It was humble, but it was clean, and it was safe. He ordered his most trusted slaves to bring them food, wine, and most wondrously of all, hot water for a bath and clean clothes. That evening, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Decius sat down to a proper meal at a clean table. He wore a soft linen tunic, slept on a soft bed. He was safe behind the high walls of his friend's villa, 1,000 miles from the hunters in Rome, as he lay in the quiet darkness, listening not to the screams of the Subura, but to the gentle chirping of crickets in the Greek night. The tight, iron knot of fear that had been clenched in his gut for months finally began to loosen. He had done the impossible. He had survived. The first few weeks at the villa of Tiberius Claudius Pallio were a surreal dream. The grinding daily terror that had been Decius's constant companion for months began to recede, replaced by a profound and unfamiliar sense of peace. He and Sosigens lived in quiet seclusion in their guest house, their needs attended to by Pallio's most trusted servants. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Decius could sleep through the night, without being startled awake by the sound of footsteps in a hallway or a distant shout. He spent his days reading the scrolls from Pallio's library, walking in the small, walled garden attached to his quarters, and slowly, carefully allowing himself to believe that the worst was over. He would look out from his window at the rolling, sun-drenched hills of Greece, a landscape of silver-green olive trees and dark cypress groves that was so similar to his lost home in Italy, yet fundamentally different. It was a beautiful, peaceful world, but he was a prisoner within it. He could see it, but he could not touch it. The high walls of the villa, which had at first seemed a symbol of sanctuary, now felt like the boundaries of a comfortable, well-appointed cage. The illusion of safety was shattered by the arrival of a ship from Brundisium. The vessel brought not only fresh supplies of wine and mail for the Roman expatriates in Corinth, but also the latest news and decrees from the capital. One evening, Pallio came to the guest house. His usually cheerful, florid face was pale and drawn. He held a newly unsealed scroll in his hand, "The news from Rome is not good," Pallio said, his voice strained. He did not sit down. The triumvirs are not satisfied. They have raised the bounties, and they have sent their own agents to the provinces, to Greece, to Asia. He looked at Decius, his eyes filled with a new, sharp fear. They have been given authority by Antony himself to hunt down and execute any proscribed man found outside of Italy. The local governors have been ordered to assist them. The bounties are now being formally advertised in the Forum at Corinth.
Ow.
The words struck Decius with the force of a physical blow. The sea was no longer a barrier. The long miles he had traveled were meaningless. The triumvirate's reach was as long as the empire's, and their hunt was now officially sanctioned in the very province where he stood. His sanctuary was no longer a remote hiding place. It was now a known enemy territory. The change in his host was immediate and profound. Pallio's fear, which had been a vague, abstract concern, now became a concrete and ever-present reality, friendly if nervous. Host was replaced by a terrified man who saw his own family's doom in Decius's continued presence. His visits to the guest house became shorter and less frequent. The easy conversation about philosophy and old times vanished, replaced by tense, anxious questions. "Have you made any plans for where you might go next?" he would ask. "Is it possible there are friends further east, in Syria, perhaps, who might be able to help?" Decius understood. He was no longer a friend being sheltered. He was a mortal liability. The friendship and old loyalty that had prompted Pallio to take him in were now straining and cracking under the immense pressure of fear. Pallio was a good man, but his goodness had its limits, and those limits were the safety of his own wife and children. The paranoia that had subsided began to creep back into Decius's life, stronger than ever. Pollio, in his anxiety, had warned his household slaves that they were to speak to no one of the guests, on pain of death. But this only confirmed to the entire staff that something secret and dangerous was happening. Decius felt their eyes on him whenever a servant brought a meal. He saw them whispering in the gardens. Were they loyal, or was the lure of the massive bounty, some that could buy a slave his freedom and make him a rich man, slowly eroding their obedience? Every unexpected event became a source of terror. A dog barking at the gate in the middle of the night, a visit from a local magistrate on routine business, a group of unfamiliar travelers on the road below the village incident sent a jolt of panic through both Decius and his host. The sanctuary had become a pressure cooker of shared anxiety. The very air seemed thick with the unspoken fear of the inevitable knock on the door. Decius realized with a sinking heart that he had only traded one trap for another. In Rome, he had been hunted by faceless soldiers and greedy bounty hunters. Here he was being slowly and politely suffocated by the fear of a friend. He could see the agonizing conflict in Pallio's eyes each time they met. The man was being torn apart by his conscience and his terror. Decius knew he could not stay. To remain was to force a good man to live in a state of constant fear, and to risk becoming the cause of his ruin. The question was no longer if he would be discovered, but whether the knock on the door would come from a Roman agent, or whether his friend's fear would finally compel him to take matters into his own hands. The safe harbor was gone, and Decius was once again adrift on a sea of imminent danger. The end of the sanctuary came not with a bang, but with a quiet, mutual acknowledgement of an impossible situation. One evening, Decius requested to speak with Pallio alone in the main garden, as the sun was setting. My friend Decius began, his voice filled with a weary gratitude. Your friendship has saved my life, but I cannot allow my presence to destroy yours. We will leave at dawn. The look of profound, shameful relief that washed over Palleo's face was all the confirmation Decius needed. His friend, a good man pushed to his absolute limit, agreed to help one last time. He would provide them with money, supplies, and a map to a remote, mountainous region where they might find anonymity among shepherds and farmers. They were unaware that their fate had already been sealed. A household slave, a man who served their meals, had pieced together their story from overheard whispers and his master's palpable fear. The lure of the bounty, a sum that could buy him not only his freedom, but a small estate of his own, was too powerful to resist. A few days earlier he had slipped away from the villa and made the journey to Corinth, where he sought out the local Roman authorities. He had traded the secret of his master's guests for the promise of gold and liberty. On the final night, as Decius and Sosigenes were making their last quiet preparations to leave, the end came. It did not come as a chaotic raid or a band of brutish bounty hunters. It came as three quiet, professional figures emerging from the shadows of the cypress trees in the garden. They were soldiers, led by a centurion whose armor was plain and functional. They moved with a silent, inexorable purpose. Sosigenes saw them first and tried to stand in the doorway of the guest house, a small knife in his hand. The centurion simply brushed him aside with a contemptuous shove that sent the freedman sprawling to the ground. The soldiers entered the small room. The centurion's eyes met Decius's. There was no anger or malice in his gaze, only a weary professionalism. He had been sent to do a job. Decius alias Scaurus, he said, his voice calm and even. It was not a question. In that moment, a strange peace descended upon Decius. The running was over. The constant grinding fear, the paranoia, the sleepless nights, it was all at an end. He had run 1,000 miles, crossed a sea, and hidden in the shadows. But the long arm of the state had found him.
Oh.
There was a certain relief in the finality of it. He gave a single, slow nod of acknowledgement. He was led out into the beautiful, fragrant garden, the same garden where he had felt his first moments of peace in months. He looked up at the Greek sky, at the first stars beginning to appear in the twilight. He thought briefly of his wife and son, and hoped they were safe. The story of Decius, alias Scaurus, the wealthy equestrian, the man of business, the fugitive, ended there, in the quiet of a borrowed garden, another nameless victim consumed by the gears of history. Sosigenes, the loyal freedman who had risked everything, was executed alongside him, a grim footnote in the ledger of the Proscriptions. His loyalty rewarded with death. This quiet, grim scene was repeated hundreds of times across the Roman world. In Italy, the great orator Cicero was hunted down and killed. His head and hands displayed in the forum he had so often commanded with his voice. In the provinces, senators, knights, and wealthy citizens were systematically tracked, betrayed, and executed. It is crucial to understand that the proscriptions were not simply an act of political vengeance. They were, first and foremost, a financial necessity for the triumvirs. They needed to pay for their massive armies to fight the final civil war against Brutus and Cassius. The state treasury was empty. Proscriptions were the solution, a horrific state-sponsored campaign of murder and robbery. The vast fortunes of men like Decius, their homes, their lands, and their accounts, were confiscated and used to pay the legions. The bounty on each head was not just an incentive, it was a privatization of the state's political violence, turning ordinary citizens into a network of informers and executioners. The deaths of over 300 senators and 2,000 equestrians were the bloody investment that funded the final collapse of the Roman Republic and paved the way for the rise of the Roman Empire. The hunt for Decius is over. His desperate struggle, like that of so many others, has come to its quiet, inevitable end. He was a man caught in the turning of a great and terrible wheel, a time when laws became weapons and a name on a list was a death sentence. The paranoia and the fear are now just whispers, fading into the long silence of the past. His long, sleepless night is over, and now so is yours. There is nothing left to do but to rest, to let go of the day, and to drift into the deep and peaceful sleep that you deserve.